Hello everyone and welcome back to Real History. I'm your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and in this installment we are going to be examining a film that many of you have been campaigning for a long time. And that is one of the first World War II movies that I ever saw in a movie theater. And that is the 2001 Second World War film entitled Enemy at the Gates. People have very strong reactions about this movie, and once again, I'm going to be trying to separate fact from fiction as we move along. But if you haven't done so already, please make sure you hit that subscribe button below. We also invite you to leave comments for us as well. What do you think Enemy at the Gates excels at or doesn't excel at? Let's have that conversation together right now. I think one of the aspects that Enemy at the Gates really excels at is atmosphere. While the material, culture, and props might not always be perfect, I think the set dressing and the grittiness really captures a flavor that puts us in the moment. And then perhaps the strongest trait of all is James Horner's fantastic soundtrack, which I think really lends an ominous tone to the whole movie throughout. Oh, I really miss James Horner. Gone too soon. But how's the rest of the film going to fare? Well, we're going to find out. Despite the fact that the borders on this map of Eastern Europe show a somewhat contemporary view of European borders, I absolutely love the look of this overview. It very much lends us a sense of the vastness of the war, not to mention that it looks like a graphic out of a Technicolor newsreel of the time period. And regardless of some of its inconsistencies, I just really appreciate the aesthetics. All that said, the Nazis never invaded Turkey, as this map would suggest to us. The opening of the boxcars reveals this really big vista, really impressive vista of the Volga River and the ravaged city beyond. And it plays out almost like a curtain rising above a stage. And theatrically, it works really well, I think, though the actual railroad route came several miles short of the city, so they wouldn't have been able to go directly from rail to river, as we see right here. I'll also add that it would have been completely counterproductive to lock soldiers into these boxcars because the Luftwaffe, as we're soon to see here, the German Air Force, remained pretty dominant over the city throughout October and November of 1942. And if your train had been strafed, your goose would have been cooked had you been trapped within and been unable to escape. So probably not a lot of that happening. The level of disorganization that we see here as the troops are being thrown into battle is really something. In reality, Vassili Zaitsev was a warrant officer when he arrived at Stalingrad with the 1047th Rifle Regiment. And undoubtedly, the filmmakers were trying to replicate the sort of violent chaos that made the beginning of Saving Private Ryan so memorable and so effective. But instead, we get this carnival of carnage, if you will, in which there are seemingly no organized units and not even rifles to distribute to the masses. It simply doesn't match the reality on a broader scale. By 1942, if rifles were in short supply for whatever reason for a specific unit, machine pistols, which were in fairly abundant supply, were going to be distributed instead. And so I do not think that this is a very accurate scenario that we see here, sending men unarmed into battle.
The Tartars will be shot! Fire! Fire!
My. The commissars ordering machine gun crews to open up on their own men certainly was not the standard operating procedure. in situations like this. However, as we just saw, this isn't to say that some of those who fell back couldn't be held accountable for promoting a sense of defeatism. Earlier, we saw the men who were being gunned down as they were jumping out of the boats. I think maybe perhaps that might be a little bit more realistic to a certain extent. But in any regard, retreats could lead to arrests by the secret police and the NKVD. And the worst fate of all was left for deserters, over 13,000 of whom are going to be executed as the Battle of Stalingrad is ongoing. And just a little bit of context and comparison in this regard, the only American soldier who is formally executed by the U.S. Army during the Second World War, Private Eddie Slovak of the 28th Infantry Division. That's one man. And then here in one battle, we have 13,000 being executed for desertion. And so I think it's safe to assume that there's a slightly different worldview here between different Allied countries. A little bit of background on Stalingrad itself might be useful as we head into the war-torn streets here. Over the previous 20 years, the city had become a major metropolitan area due to the rapid industrialization and modernization during the Stalin era, and indeed the renaming of the city after the Soviet dictator was somewhat of a psychological component that made this city so unique, so sought after, and so important in the mindset of both sides. Not to mention it being the gateway to the oil fields in the Caucasus, as was mentioned at the outset of the movie. At the beginning of the war, this was a huge city that was home to over 500,000 people, over 600,000 people to be exact. And by the fall of 1942, soldiers on both sides had become firmly entrenched, and I'm talking politically, militarily, and literally. And as we get a sense of from the beginning here, the fate of Eastern Europe is hanging in the balance. This is going to become the decisive engagement of the Second World War. It's kind of this eureka moment in the film where, oh, this prodigy is discovered, this marksman in the making is found. But the film incorrectly gives the impression that Vassili Zaitsev is a conscript who just happens to be a good marksman thanks to his prior life as a shepherd in a rural area, a remote area of the Soviet Union. But in reality, Zaitsev was a college-educated man, and he had already served at least 5 years in the Russian Navy. He had served in the Pacific Fleet. He had seen a good portion of the world. He was very accustomed to the dynamics of military life. And so the idea that this is his trial by fire in the truest sense perhaps might not be a fully accurate assessment. So the question remains now, if he had been in the Navy, how does he end up here as a ground troop on the front lines at the Battle of Stalingrad? And in short, after Operation Barbarossa in 1941, where Hitler had betrayed his supposed ally, the Soviet Union, and turns against Joseph Stalin and invades Russia, that was very much considered to be an all-hands-on-deck moment. And in certain cases, people perhaps in other branches, the Navy in this case, were afforded or ordered the opportunity to go and serve as a ground soldier. And that is exactly what becomes of Vassili Zaitsev, who, as I said, enters service here as a warrant officer. Joseph Fiennes' character of Danilov, who is presumably a composite character of real-life Soviet public relations officers, I think serves as a really interesting vehicle to illustrate the sometimes exploitive nature of military propaganda, especially within the Soviet regime. But once again, for the sake of comparables, in true Audie Murphy fashion, Zaitsev was discovered by, let's say, broader national culture when confirmations of his battlefield heroics emerged in Soviet literature, Soviet newspapers, periodicals, publications, and magazines. And he would prove to be just the style of hero that is very useful for morale purposes, as some of the discussions in the film would indicate. Interestingly, though, I found no mention at all of Zaitsev in American newspapers until the 1990s. And so I think, in a way, that kind of highlights the sort of bubble that we live in as we are sometimes reading about international events. Who is a hero in one country and who is unknown in other countries? I think it's a really fascinating historical question to ponder. But all the while, on the other side of the equation, pretty much none of the news of Stalingrad was permitted to be conveyed to German civilians back on the home front. Suffice it to say, they were getting a very watered down version, if not outright fabricated rendition of some of the poor happenings that were occurring here on the battlefront. Growing up when I did, I feel that it's almost impossible for me to separate Bob Hoskins from his performance as Smee in Hook, which was, in fact, one of the first movies that I saw in theaters. But nonetheless, I feel that Nikita Khrushchev's role in this film is transformed into something of a caricature. I think that's how best I can sum it up. He's shown here as both a chief propagandist as well as a military strategist. And in actuality, he very proudly served as Stalingrad's principal commissar, a chief liaison to the boss, as he refers to Stalin in the movie. And I suspect the filmmakers chose him as the movie's main political or military force due to his subsequent fame as the Soviet premier during the Cold War. But you gotta find it strange, though, that the film neglects to highlight the roles of people like Chukov or Yeremenko, who were as pivotal, more pivotal, in fact, during the battle than the likes of Khrushchev.
Thank you for everything you're doing.
And this is his friend, Commissar
Danilov.
This love triangle that emerges between Zaitsev, Danilov, and Tanya, I think deserves some clarification. Tanya is seemingly based off the real-life soldier named Tanya Chernova, who was actually a blonde, who was not Jewish, as she is indicated in the film, was actually born in the Bronx here in the United States, but was nonetheless over time drawn to the Soviet cause because of her family's ties in Russia. She was not a college graduate. She was not highly educated, as this film would suggest. She did not serve as an official translator, though I highly suspect that she spoke English, given her national background. One way that reality separates from what is depicted here in the movie is that she apparently had a bloodlust for killing German soldiers. And she certainly wasn't some damsel in distress type character, as she is sometimes portrayed in this movie. And additionally, too, as we think about this love triangle, as it's cinematically blossoming here, if later on there were any disputes between Zaitsev and somebody like Danilov, who, once again, I believe is a fictional character, if anything like that had emerged, I suspect these quarrels would have been more of a political or military or ideological nature rather than a romantic nature. So, in short, this movie tries to be the Russian version of the movie Pearl Harbor, which, interestingly enough, comes out the very same year as this film in 2001. Ed Harris is such a superb and underrated actor, and he just excels at playing the stone-cold German villain here in the form of Major König, who was purported by some to be a master marksman who facilitated a sniper's training school in Germany. And as we look at his uniform here, his Iron Cross would indicate that he served with gallantry during the First World War. The ribbon that he is sporting on his chest is a non-combatant World War I medal. So those two things are kind of at odds with each other. So this is a slight oops on the part of the costuming department, but that's small, trivial stuff. The bigger problem here yet is that there isn't much substantive evidence to suggest that Major König even existed. If he had been in charge of some Wehrmacht training school for snipers, there would be more of a definitive record of his existence, but it is simply not there. So once again, we must beg the question, did Major König in fact exist? Let's dig into all of this a little bit further.
Stay where you are!
This scene where the Junkers 88 German bombers descend over this old commercial district and department store is truly effective from a cinematic standpoint because it very much accentuates that sense of pre-existing foreboding that we see in the movie. You really get the sense that you're sitting atop this ticking time bomb, and the ticking gets louder and louder and louder as the movie goes along. I think that's one of the really effective things of this film. And the beginning of the cat and mouse games is where the movie, I think, really thrives as a form of entertainment. Like this back and forth here between Zaitsev and König as it's getting started. However, the Junkers that we see flying in here were high altitude bombers. Had they targeted buildings like this from such a low height, they probably would have been compromised by their own bombs that they were dropping. So you would have seen them much higher in the air. You wouldn't have seen them at all from this ground level perspective. But undoubtedly, those are put there at that low altitude to make it perfectly evident to the audience of the impending peril.
Son of a bitch! These are new pants. I just took them off a captain from the 251st yesterday.
I love a good scene with the great Ron Perlman as much as anybody does. But I find it a bit humorous that here we have an American speaking in a British accent while portraying a Russian soldier. I guess he had to blend in with all the other actors who didn't sound like they were Russians. At the same time, I'm glad Ed Harris didn't lay it on too thick with a German accent, because I think he carries himself with the sort of stoical swagger that might have been seen in an old school officer of this era. The scenes in the tractor factory, I think, are quite effective from the standpoint of production design, especially. This very much encapsulates, in my view, the hellish, apocalyptic setting of the once industrial heart of the city. And the Germans referred to fighting in this environment as Rattenkrieg, which means rat warfare, which I think perfectly sums up how they were assessing the situation. From a production point of view, these scenes, I believe, were shot in an abandoned plant near Rudersdorf, Germany. And I think it comes off rather well from an authenticity standpoint. It really looks the part.
Get your head down.
Tell me where he is.
Stay into that pipe, Tanya. Stay in. Stay in. Get your head in.
There are definitely some Titanic movie vibes going on in this film as well. Despite the fact that our lovebirds are constantly being separated by the disaster that is unfolding around them, they always manage to reunite under the worst of circumstances. It's some good soap opera formula playing out here, but perhaps not the best of history. In this, what I think is a fairly awkward love scene, definitely made me a bit wide-eyed when I first saw it in movie theaters as a teenager when it was originally released. But did something like this actually happen? Zaitsev and Chernova undoubtedly shared some form of camaraderie during Stalingrad, but was it this intimate? Was it sexual, as we see depicted here? Chernova later said yes. Zaitsev said no. And so apparently these sorts of conversations and disputes emerged while William Craig was writing the book for which this movie is named. And a lot of that research was taking place in the early 1970s. In the years since, historian Anthony Beevor, who himself has written a massive tome on the Battle of Stalingrad, has dismissed a lot of Craig's melodramatic narrative and his writings, especially the Zaitsev-König duel. So he pretty much insists that that never took place, and I suppose it's in the realm of possibility that the same is also true of the romantic subplot that we see in this movie.
Tell him what you know, Sasha. Hello, Sasha.
There was dust on the Major's boots.
Sasha has the Major convinced he's gone over to the other side.
When I first saw this film, I was able to empathize with the character of Sasha to an extent. I wasn't too much older than him as I was going to see this film. But Sasha Filippov was actually a real-life person, but he was about 5 years older than the actor who we see here. In reality, he was 17 years old, and over the course of several months, he had been acting as a boot repairman. He'd been a cobbler, infiltrating the German lines that way, fixing their boots, and in these rough conditions, that was considered to be a welcomed amenity. But all the while he is tendering those services, he was also gathering intelligence, he was assessing numbers, he was purportedly infiltrating German headquarters, he was able to smuggle out paperwork. And so the real-life Sasha had, to an extent, created associations, networks, perhaps even friendships among German soldiers. But it is happening in an entirely different context. And though in the movie he is hanged, and it's a really brutal scene, he's hanged by König to lure in Zaitsev as bait, he was actually hanged alongside two other operatives who were being punished for their espionage activities against the Germans. And this took place 2 days before Christmas in 1942. And apparently some of his neighbors or family members were witness to some of this. You know, this poor kid being hauled to his death barefoot through the freshly fallen snow. That could have been just as effective a bit of cinema as what we see here. But in order to play on the heartstrings of the audience, Sasha is made to be somebody much younger. And in the process, it also helps make König look like even more of a monster than what we, the audience, know he already is. But about a year and a half later, in 1944, Sasha was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his heroics and his intelligence gathering. So a very valiant young man that we have here in real life. Tanya was in fact wounded, and I found at least one article that claims that Vassili was actually the one that carried her to the hospital, but it's difficult to ascertain if that's actually true because there are other accounts that state that she was actually wounded by a landmine, not at the Battle of Stalingrad, but in the battle for Berlin in 1945, in the final phase of the war. But it would seem that both of these individuals had thought one another dead for many decades following the war until the 1960s or the 1970s, where their relationship is reestablished. Their friendship, I think, is perhaps a better way to word that, is reestablished through written correspondence. Whether there was in fact a love story or not, both of them had married by that point. They had moved on with their lives, and that ship had sailed. This climactic and somewhat satisfying defeat of König may or may not have happened to one degree or another. One version states that Zaitsev later recounted that he was in a duel near a train station. One of his comrades purposely revealed his position as a trick to unveil the hidden German marksman. Zaitsev saw the subsequent muzzle flash, he fired, and a helmet came tumbling out of the building. And in fact, there is a version of this that is depicted in an earlier part of the movie. And then Zaitsev goes into that building. He retrieves the paperwork and the identity of the marksman that he had just killed, and supposedly that information indicated that that fallen individual was none other than Major König. However, none of this can be fully corroborated or verified in the official records. And so the big question here is, did elements of this scenario play out? Maybe, maybe not. My suspicion is that König is kind of the best hits composite of a number of duels or scenarios or anecdotes that involve Zaitsev, and it becomes somewhat of an urban legend in modern day lore as the Soviet war was continuing. And so that's probably the best definition that I'll be able to offer in that regard. As one historian noted, his deeds led to a cult of sniperism, if you will, that was a source of inspiration for soldiers and civilians alike as the war dragged on. And indeed, when your country loses 20 million people in a conflict, it's very useful, very effective, very inspirational to have national heroes who you can look up to. And sure enough, according to his official record, Zaitsev kills something like 225 enemy combatants as the Battle of Stalingrad was ongoing. And no matter which way you cut it, that is an impressive, lethal record. Although some Nazi leaders claim Stalingrad to be a victory, such as they proclaimed it to the German people, everybody today knows that most certainly is not the case. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, which ultimately entrapped an Axis army of multiple nations. And by February 2nd, 1943, that army capitulated. The German invasion had been staved off, but at a horrific price of some 2 million lives lost between both sides. Undoubtedly the costliest and most important battle of the Second World War. Ultimately, I think Enemy at the Gates shows some real strength in creating an authentic environment, but it ultimately comes short of being the definitive film on the Battle of Stalingrad. As is often the case with movies like this, the unnecessary and mostly inaccurate romantic subplots, I think, really detract from a very otherwise suspenseful, if not always accurate, narrative. I think another reason, though, why Enemy at the Gates could be considered at least a little bit valuable is that for Western European and American audiences, it highlights an aspect of the war that most people don't know about. Oftentimes we have a very U.S. Anglo-centric understanding of the Second World War without taking into account the massive amount of loss on the part of the Soviet Union, warts and all within its communist system and its regime of oppression. But this is the major force that helps to stomp the Third Reich into submission, partnering with other allied nations, of course. So if nothing else, the movie is useful in that regard. I'd also say that a far stronger movie about this battle is the 1993 anti-war German film simply entitled Stalingrad. And in that movie, we get the opposite perspective, of course, from the Germans themselves, but it's such a forceful film because it helps to convey the hardship that common soldiers faced on the battlefront, including the brutal natural elements. The winter of 1942, 1943 was one for the books. And that 1993 movie does a very effective job in helping to illustrate that. So perhaps that is a future one that we will save for an upcoming episode of Real History. Thank you so much for tuning in to our historical breakdown of the 2001 movie, Enemy at the Gates. We hope you enjoyed it. We welcome your comments below. What are your thoughts on this movie? Please hit that like and subscribe button as well. As we always say, every little bit helps. Until we see you next time here on Real History, stay curious.